Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and thank you for tracking out across in the snow indeed. Situated on the Pacific Ring of Fire, the Indonesian province, can you hear me if I step away from the screen? The Indonesian province of West Sumatra has a long history of seismic activity that has profoundly shaped the environment and its inhabitants. On September 30th, 2009, a 7.6 magnitude earthquake struck the coastal region, including the provincial capital, Padang. It left a death toll of more than 1,100 people. It damaged hundreds and thousands of buildings and generated landslides that swept away entire villages. More than 1 million people, a quarter of the province's population, were affected with the loss of life, loved ones, homes, businesses, or livelihoods. While the death toll and scale of devastation of the quake pale in comparison to the Indian Ocean tsunami, the Haiti earthquake, or the tsunami in Japan, disasters, I argue here, are experienced first and foremost locally. This earthquake was the most devastating disaster on record to hit the homeland of the Minangkabau, who constitute almost 90% of West Sumatra's population and are found in immigrant communities scattered throughout the Indonesian archipelago. No person identifying as Minangkabau, regardless of where they reside, could ignore what this earthquake has meant for the homeland. Inspired by anthropological studies of disaster that investigate the dynamic interplay of environmental, social, and cultural factors, this paper explores musical responses to the disaster through a series of commercial music videos released in the earthquake's aftermath. How have Minangkabau people made sense of the disaster that caused not only the destruction of the natural and built environment, but also disrupted lives on a physical, social, and ideological level? How has the destruction been reflected in musical practices? How have people musically inscribed their grief? In summary, what can music tell us about the localized ways of experiencing and making sense of catastrophic environmental events? In June 2010, more than 8 months after the quake, I was back in West Sumatra. I went to the local record store to check out what was the latest thing in Minang music. Flipping through the racks of video compact discs, a highly compressed video format popular in Asia, I came across albums with titles like this one, or album covers featuring a woman veiled praying to God, or images of the disaster. I wondered if the artists, some of whom I knew personally, were victims. Just 8 months before, I had watched aghast as the news footage unfolded about the devastation in a place where I had lived and worked for more than 2 years. My own emotional connection to the disaster was intensely personal, but here was a public discourse about it. During 2 months of fieldwork that summer, I combed stores and stores looking for musical material related to the earthquake, both in West Sumatra and then in Jakarta, where there is a sizable migrant population. I collected 10 VCD albums with a total of 29 songs and 1 double cassette-length epic. The genres range from regionally specific traditions with limited audience bases to more mainstream popular styles. It was the incorporation and adaptation of indigenous vocal genres that I had learned to perform and worked on in the past, that particularly fascinated me. What tools did they offer to make sense of this catastrophic event? We get a hint in the opening track of Alkawi and Reni's Earthquake album. Following Minangkabau literary and social conventions, their VCD is prefaced with an offering of ritualized speech. You will find the lyrics in Figure 1 on your handout. Lines 1 through 4 use conventional greetings. Lines 5 through 8 are significant for the Islamic explanation of the disaster they offer. And I foolishly forgot to get myself one. So if you read example number 1, these lines, disaster has arrived in the Minangkabau homeland. It is best to be taken to become a guide. Huge earthquake shook the earth. Clearly, a reminder from God. The idea that the earthquake is a test from God is consistent throughout the corpus of material. I will return to this issue later on. For now, it is lines 9 through 12 that particularly concern us. They reference the VCD that dendang, a kind of local song, becomes a venue to pour out one's feelings. The idea that grief can be encapsulated in song. So if we look at example number 2, although just a fragment, this VCD arrives, forming the same feeling in our bodies, pouring out hearts that are crushed in dendang, framing our cries in nyanyi. Now let's watch the track. It's accompanied by a flute called the salawang. You'll hear it again later. Oops, sorry.
Assalamualaikum pambuka kato. Salam tatabuah kanan rami. Taim pun sambah jo simpur di dalamnya. Doa salamai kadun sana dari kami. Wancano nanti bu karanah Minang. Elok diambil jadi padoman. Gampo gadang bumi baguncang. Nyato sebuah taguran dari Tuhan. Walau sekapiang VCD konan datang, ujui saraso badan kami, patuang hati naluluh dalam dendang, babingkaikan tangis dalam nyanyi.
Anthropologists of disaster, Susanna Hoffman and Anthony Oliver Smith, suggest that, quote, disasters expose the way in which people construct or frame their peril, including their denial of it, the way they perceive their environment and their subsistence, and the ways they invent explanation, constitute their mortality, and project their continuity and promise into the future, end quote. In this presentation, I show how music videos present powerful local encodings of the earthquake by incorporating, speaking to, and even transforming existing local practices, Minangkabau musical and literary conventions, along with philosophical approaches and social habits related to death and destruction. The music videos offer a venue for the artists, the producers, and their audiences to comprehend, make sense of, come together, and ultimately, one could argue, survive the catastrophe. It's important to recognize that the videos are not merely a reflection of the disaster, but constitute an active engagement with it. In Minangkabau ritual, literary, and vernacular life, aphorisms are frequently invoked to encapsulate central tenets of Minangkabau philosophy. These videos enact one that underpins Minangkabau cultural responses to tragedy and death. Kabar baik diimbauan, kabar buruk baambauan. Good news is to be publicized, bad news is to flow. Azul Jam'an, my host father and community leader, explained to me that good news, like a child marrying, is publicized so that the community shares in the joy of celebration, while bad news, like a death or tragedy, is revealed so that it generates condolences and aid from the community. In Minangkabau life, even in the most urbanized settings, the experience of grief is public and communal in its expression. Sharing in the tragedy of others is a social and religious obligation. These music videos allow the bad news to flow through a combination of music, lyrics, and visual images. My analysis, supplemented with ethnographic videos with musicians, lyricists, and record store owners, explores how each of these components of music videos are utilized to commemorate the events and places affected and convey the grief of the Minangkabau community writ large. The music videos have been carefully crafted to most effectively spread the news, creating communal bonding and eliciting physical and fiscal aid in the process. While these music videos share the devastation amongst a broadly defined Minangkabau community constituted by both people in the homeland and those who have left, many of the songs and albums are designed to tug at the heartstrings of the migrants who have made their fortunes outside West Sumatra, maintain strong affective ties for the homeland, and have the financial resources to help. The music videos present one of the most publicly accessible, widely disseminated, and relatively cohesive local accounts of what the disaster has meant for the Minangkabau. It is necessary to point out that these ways of engaging and making sense of the disaster are specific to the Minangkabau. They are contingent on the role of music and literature within everyday life, on philosophical and religious outlooks on tragedy, along with the strong relationships migrants maintain with the homeland. In the anthropology, sociology, and psychology of disasters, the study of music has been overlooked. Yet, as I demonstrate here, attention to the musical manifestations of natural disasters can potentially be extremely valuable for understanding the cultural experiences of them. Before delving into an analysis of the imagery, music, and lyrics of these videos and their social significance, some background on the seismology of West Sumatra and the Minangkabau is necessary. Situated on the Pacific Ring of Fire, West Sumatra is identified as a particular hotspot. The province lays over both the Great Sumatra Fault Line, the line running through the island, and the subduction zone where the Eurasian plate converges with the Indo-Australian one. That's the line running underneath, purple line. Snags in the tectonic movement occur with higher incidence along this stretch, which combined with the fault line explains the long history of and great potential for future earthquakes. The coastal plain of the mainland, as you can see in this slide, is only a few miles deep before running into the Barisan mountain range that stretches the length of Sumatra and is home to some 35 active volcanoes. Sumatra's most active one, Mount Merapi, literally Mountain of Fire, towers over the West Sumatran highlands. Now to spend a moment on the terminology of disasters. Hazards are defined as, quote, the forces, conditions, or technologies that carry potential for social, infrastructural, or environmental damage, end quote. In West Sumatra, the seismogenic and tsunami-genic potential of the region constitutes a hazard. We are quick to identify earthquakes as, quote, natural disasters. But in disaster studies, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Hazards may or may not turn into disasters. They do so only when they encounter a human, quote, population in a socially and economically produced condition of vulnerability, resulting in a perceived disruption of individual and social needs for physical survival, social order, and meaning, end quote. Not all seismic events, then, turn into disasters of this scale, but a number of factors, including poor construction standards, turned this particular earthquake into one. Houses, schools, hospitals, places of worship, and markets, along with roads, bridges, and irrigation systems, were damaged. This earthquake was, with a toll of 1,100 people, the worst disaster in the recorded history of the Minangkabau. The Minangkabau have lived with hazards in their environments for years. Why, one might wonder, are they willing to continue to do so? Aside from the political and socio-economic factors limiting mobility, these videos help explain why the Minangkabau are willing to live with such potentially destructive agents. The fatalism associated with Islamic beliefs, especially the submission to divine will, has much to do with the acceptance of the risks. The Minangkabau are a heterogeneous group known for Islamic piety, matrilineal kinship systems, extensive out-migration, nationalist activism, and sometimes spicy food, amongst other things. The contemporary province of West Sumatra contains the Minangkabau homeland. According to the 2000 census, the first to take ethnicity into account since the colonial era, almost 69% of Indonesia's 5.4 million strong Minangkabau population live in the province. The remaining fraction are located in neighboring Sumatran provinces and scattered throughout the archipelago, with sizable populations in large cities like Jakarta. While many people have temporarily or permanently migrated for purposes of employment, education, or marriage, most migrants retain a strong emotional attachment to the homeland and their home village, the village to which their ancestry is tied through their mother's line. Islam has been a part of Minangkabau's social experience for centuries. Today, one cannot identify as Minangkabau without professing Islam as one's faith, but what it means in daily life can differ radically. For example, there are devout Muslims, including the family I live with, who strictly follow the 5 pillars of Islam, and yet others I knew and worked with who rarely prayed. The large majority are moderate Muslims whose incorporation of Islam into their daily lives is evidenced through visual, sonic, and other behavioral means. It is no surprise, then, that the Islamic understandings of the divine played a part in interpretations of the disasters. Now I'll turn to the videos. It is significant that all but one of these albums was produced as a VCD, a medium that combines sound with visuals in a more economical format than that required by DVD technology, although this means the picture quality is highly condensed in comparison. VCDs are the medium of this disaster because the images really do speak 1,000 words. They heighten and perhaps even eclipse the emotional impact that can be delivered through sounds and words of the music alone. Producers of the earthquake albums have exploited the visual capabilities of the medium, combining cell phone videos and news footage taken at the time of the earthquake and in the following weeks. These albums show traumatized survivors, the devastation of the natural and built environments, and the recovery efforts in progress. There are scenes involving crushed corpses, piles of body bags, and burials. Some videos even include footage that captures people in their deepest moments of grief. For example, this particular clip from Ria Amelia's song, which is in a pop Indonesia format. Many record producers have capitalized on the affective capacity of the devastated areas by superimposing footage of the artists over images of these sites or shooting directly on location, in addition to using genres, tunes, and instruments associated with them. Take, for instance, this clip that features a song, a type of fiddle, and imagery intentionally used to signify the Pariaman region, a coastal area with almost 60% of the fatalities and significant structural devastation. The imagery combines a montage of the wreckage with artists superimposed over one of the most iconic images of this disaster, the massive landslides that wiped out an entire village. The lyrics of the track, highlighted across the screen karaoke style as the vocalists sing them, narrate basic details about time of the quake, places affected, physical destruction, and the psychological trauma suffered.
Tanggal 30 September 2009.
Another album explicitly targets Minangkabau migrants by including narratives about the fates of famous landmarks in and around Padang. It's emotionally efficacious, or at least it was for me, thinking about the spaces, including that department store that I used to visit. Record store keeper Arman, pictured earlier, suggested that an album's viability sometimes had more to do with the video footage than the music per se. Migrants back in the homeland following the disaster would come into his store requesting to preview the different albums. They often purchased one if it included footage of their home village or other familiar areas. While Erman cited recordings related to previous disasters, the 2009 earthquake has produced the largest discography of Minangkabau commercial recordings related to a single disaster. I don't think it was the scale of devastation alone that explains this fact, but also the effective power this particular medium brings to the cause, and an increasingly sophisticated exploitation of its capabilities. Music videos on VCD format were the medium of this particular disaster in a way that social media like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were of the Arab Spring. As the soundtrack for publicizing bad news, producers of these albums have focused on genres that generate deep emotional responses amongst listeners, appeal to the migrant community, or do both. The sentimentalism of pop Minang, a broadly defined genre of popular music in the Minangkabau language, has been harnessed to inscribe the grief of the tragedy, while simultaneously playing on migrants' attachments to the homeland. The composers of pop Minang songs about the earthquake exploit the genre's conventions to heighten this emotional impact, including a gradual increase in dramatic intensity through instrumentation and vocal register. For example, here is Yen Rustam pleading with God for mercy. She is backed by a synthesized angelic-sounding vocal chorus. Some of the songs also incorporate the idioms of pop Islami or Islamic pop in sections where the lyrics are religious in nature. For example, Young Patapayan sings an unmetered improvisatory passage that is evocative of vocal improvisations in Arabic music and the call to prayer and Quranic recitation, while a male chorus chants the dhikr La ilaha illallah. Behind, there is no God but Allah, part of the declaration of faith and one of the pillars of Islam. While the idioms of local popular styles like this are emotionally powerful, I'm particularly interested in the ways that grief has been encoded through indigenous Minangkabau genres. Some of these have been used because they directly reference the devastated coastal regions. Other genres have been adopted because they are already used to convey sadness in conventional practice, sang being an important forum in Minangkabau life for the public expression of intense emotions. As vocalists literally weep as they tell the story, Rabab Pasisia, a genre from the southern coastal region, is particularly effective.
Ora minyo sabala para adobala po sabalanyo baliela leina namande amala rindu di tanaga tatimbuna oh di matampe nyoyo nai.
One of the most effective genres used for this disaster, and the one that I would like to focus on in the following analysis, is a genre that involves vocals accompanied by the salawang, or oblique flute, as seen here where Mak Sawir, a vocalist with a full-length Earthquake album, is performing live at an event. While the genre originates in the heartland, away from the center of this disaster, it involves one to several vocalists, accompanied by a single flute, performing heterophonic versions of a melody. The structure of the taxostrophic, with flute interludes between and punctuating the verses. The news media were the first to realize the capability of salawang to musically embody the despair and suffering of Minangkabau people following the tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, the genre was employed as a soundtrack for sharing bad news, literally accompanying footage of the devastation wrought on people and the landscape, as seen in this example from the national TV station Metro TV. The recording industry quickly recognized the emotional efficacy of salawang. Sahwir, who has released hundreds of albums since the 1970s, related how a producer approached him within a month after the disaster, requesting an entire album with stories about the earthquake. The artist utilized tunes and titles that embody the personal and communal trauma felt, drawing entirely on the sad category of songs in the salawang repertoire, including material from the subcategory of laments for the dead. His title track, Pariaman Lamo, was chosen for the indexicality of place, Pariaman, one of the most devastated regions. For salawang, much of the music's power lies in the lyrical content. Texts for a given melody change from one artist and performance to the next. Strophic in form, a melodic cycle is repeated while the choice of text and number of times through the cycle varies according to the circumstances. The flexible nature of text has certainly facilitated the adoption of this genre to spread the bad news, allowing artists to craft their text to narrate the basic facts of the disaster, discuss the devastation and trauma suffered, plea for assistance, and locate its root cause not in the scientific language of seismology, but in its Islamic interpretations of divine will. Adapting the tunes to this particular topic is not a substantial departure from usual practice. There are conventions that suggest the appropriate sentiment for each song, though the earthquake texts are more thematically focused and narrative in nature than typical texts. In Salawang Jodendang, as Sawe emphasized, it is the poetry, not the vocal quality, that draws the listeners in. A successful performance should find emotional resonance with the intended audience, ultimately inducing tears and deep reflection. Among connoisseurs of the genre, Sawir is recognized as one of the most compelling poets at work today. A successful vocalist, however, does not only have to deliver content that will touch people's hearts, but do so within the literary conventions of the genre, where allusion is prized above direct expression. They must shape their texts according to pantun, a verse form concerned with the syllabic length of lines, poetic rhyme, and arrangement of content into two segments of equal length. In this context, the lines are usually 8 or 9 syllables long. A stanza may involve anywhere from 4 to 20 lines, and the halves have a matching rhyme scheme at the ends of the lines. The first half, called sampiran, or a place to hang something, involves a philosophical or moralistic statement about human experience. The first half makes reference to specific places, plants, or animals. The second half, the isi, makes the philosophical or moralistic statement. To exemplify how this genre works to convey the grief, I'm going to focus in on his song, Pariaman Lamo, the title track on his album. Pariaman Lamo is a standard tune in the Salawang repertoire and would therefore be familiar to followers of the genre. The text is transcribed and translated in figure 2 on your handout. And this figure illustrates the division of text into the Sampiran and Isi, along with the rhyme scheme. The English translation, done by myself, is a direct one, rather than one that attempts to keep the poetic form. In this example of the pantun format, the lines are actually 10 syllables long. The stanzas mostly contain 8 lines, but not always, and the rhyme scheme for the 2 halves of the stanzas is A, B, C, D. The ends of phrases that indicate the scheme are underlined for the first stanza. Looking at the textual content, which for this song should aim to convey feelings of sadness about life or love, we see that factual information about the quake, such as the time it occurred and places affected, are mentioned in the Sampiran, such as in the first pantun. So this is example number 3. The date was September 30th, the year 2009. In the Minang land, an earthquake occurred. All around the homeland, it was dark. This conforms to the concept of Sampiran mentioning nature of places. Adhering to the concept of isi, delivering a moralistic message, the isi of the first pantun encourages migrants to pay attention to the disaster's destructive path and come back to the homeland to help. This is example 4. Come home, people of the Rantau near and far. Minang has been struck down in turmoil. People in the homeland already coaxed into crying. Tears visiting, not yet dried up. Some of the isi, such as the 4th one here, contain moralistic messages heeding people to recognize that God is ultimately in control. And this is the last one here, example 5. As a test of life, whether we will not surrender ourselves, it's the characteristic of nature, yes, to destroy. God, test my faith. Vocalists make the pantun fit the melodic line by inserting extraneous text, almost exclusively vocables or non-semantic text, in addition to repeating complete or partial lines. In live performance, vocalists do this in the heat of the moment. Figure 3 on the back of your handout indicates these additions in the central column titled Text. Plain font indicates the text proper, italic font, the vocables that are inserted, and bold, the lines that are repeated to make, so you could potentially take one pantun and plug it into a different tune, and so this makes it fit this particular tune. Like all sad songs, Pariaman Lamo is unmetered, with only occasional moments of a discernible pulse. The bulk of a pantun is delivered syllabically and rapidly in a speech-like fashion centered on one pitch, with occasional departures to neighboring notes above and below. The ends of phrases are drawn out through melismatic setting of vocables, where there are many notes per syllable. The sadness is largely conveyed through these unmetered melismatic phrases that frame the verse. Conducting an analysis of how time has been spent within one melodic cycle, I found that almost 50% was devoted to these kinds of melismatic phrases on vocables, only 33% to the core text, the remaining 17% to the flute interludes. If we look at this in relation to just the first pantun, if we take the second half of the pantun as an example, which starts on line 9 here, the first 3 lines of text take only 7 seconds in their entirety to deliver, and the vocables, the last line in the vocables, take 40 seconds altogether. The time spent on the melismatic phrases, where there is an iconicity with sobbing, has much to do with the affective capacity of these songs. The listeners have been socialized into these conventions, taught to recognize and interpret the signs, these techniques, as sadness. So we're now going to listen to this pantun, which is just part of the entire 11-minute-long track. And while the images do much to enhance the message, I've edited out so we can focus on the text, and I'll call out each line of the text as we go, so you can follow along. Line 1. Line 2. 3. Flute interlude. 4. Line 5, 6, 7, interlude. Nine, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So to summarize, the music of these VCDs collectively is emotionally efficacious because the genres used convey sadness, because of indexical references to areas devastated by the quake, and because the genres and themes speak to the migrants and mobilize them. I want to move on and wrap up with the social dimensions of disasters. Enacting the principle of sharing bad news. These videos are designed to inspire a sense of communal and religious responsibility to help out people who are less fortunate. Disasters, as Huffman and Oliver Smith write, quote, unmask the nature of a society's social structure, including the ties and resilience of kinship and other alliances. They instigate unity and the cohesion of social units, and provide a unique view of society's capacities for resistance or resilience in the face of disruption, end quote. While in some ways these videos play on alliances around specific areas of destruction, they also articulate and mobilize an imagined community of Minangkabau extending far beyond the boundaries of the province. The resilience of Minangkabau people to the disruption of this catastrophe and the threat of future ones comes partially from the strength of these ties. Many of the albums, including Sawia's, play on migrants' attachments to the homeland, urging them to help the families and communities they left behind. In doing so, the videos invoke the Minangkabau concept of manjangwak, or to call in on someone. This concept mobilizes Minangkabau people to visit the ailing and pay respects to someone who has just passed away, along with their family. Paying one's respects is a serious social obligation in the Minangkabau moral code, necessitating convoys of family, colleagues, and friends to visit. As I learned through participation in these events, manjangwak is an activity that takes precedence over economic or educational concerns, and certainly any notion of a research agenda I entertained. Visiting people suffering from a disaster, then, is in the spirit of conveying condolences, camaraderie in suffering, and giving aid. In addition to mobilizing community, these videos allow people to work through the ideological framing of the disasters, or how the Minangkabau comprehend the juncture between nature and society. As Oliver Smith suggests, constructing meaning enables, quote, individuals and groups to understand what has happened to them and develop strategies to gain some degree of control over what is transpiring, end quote. That every artist involved in this corpus of recordings understands and interprets, or at least on the surface, this disaster from an Islamic perspective is telling. In conducting the research for this article, my host father, a pious Muslim who has completed the Hajj, was most concerned the importance of this Islamic viewpoint was not disregarded, though at the same time he questioned how much the artists, some of whom he knew personally, actually embraced the piety conveyed in the videos. These albums suggest the disaster that ensued in the wake of the 7.6 magnitude earthquake reminds the Minangkabau that events within the world are never within the control of humans, but under the vagaries of divine decree. As the song texts explain, God sends such tests as retribution for straying from his path, and a reminder to ultimately surrender to his will. The subtext of these music videos is to remain pious, a sign issued by the West Sumatran police force and sponsored by a cigarette company implores, afraid of natural disasters, distance yourself from all behavior which is immoral. Ironically, as my host father pointed out, while the message conveys the appropriate religious sentiment, its efficacy is negated by the image of a couple, the woman scantily clad by local standards, embracing in a sexually suggestive manner. In the aftermath of the 2009 West Sumatran earthquake, music videos have engaged producers, artists, and their audiences directly with the disaster. The videos use existing cultural practices to inscribe the collective grief. By allowing the bad news to flow through images, language, and music, these music videos enact the aphorism that underpins Minangkabau cultural responses to death and disaster. By framing the disaster as one affecting the homeland, they mobilize people and create community around the tragedy. To musically encode the grief, producers and artists draw on genres and tunes that are known for their deep affective capacity and/or directly index the devastated regions. The incorporation of earthquake songs into live performance, as I heard at one wedding in June 2010, reinforces the importance of music giving public voice to the earthquake's emotional dimensions. A musical response to the realities of human existence in a region with serious seismogenic and tsunami-genic hazards, these videos have offered one way to cope with the aftermath of West Sumatra's worst earthquake. What I am suggesting we might even call the ethnomusicology of disasters would take into account these kinds of localized ways in which people respond to, frame, and otherwise comprehend catastrophes through musical practices. Such a study would help us more fully engage and understand the cultural dimensions of disasters. Thank you.